Welcome to Pleasure Uprising. I'm Dr. Laura Juergens, intimacy coach, somatic practitioner, and your guide to getting out of your head and into your body, your desire, and your real capacity for connection. This show is for people who are done performing and ready to actually feel it. Let's go. Hey, welcome to today's episode. We are continuing with the Attachment Wounds and Eroticism series. So today we're talking about the dependency wound, when care was never something you could count on. And there are two really distinct ways that this shows up. So I want to start with a little story about a couple. And okay, so here they both actually had this wound. They're presenting in completely different directions, and that's really common. So here's this guy. He's in his 50s. He's really, sweet guy, a little bit helpless seeming, kind of tends to bring out the caretaker in people. Also, just very confused and frustrated that his wife just does not want to meet his sexual needs and is and in emotional needs too, just wants to feel cared for more than anything. And has taken kind of a child role in the relationship. Very good at kind of getting what he wants and asking for things. Does not tend to be really taking a leadership role in thinking about, what needs to be done. How does it need to be done, right? No, that all is on his wife, who is very capable, very self-sufficient, barely ever asks anyone for help. Kind of one of those I've got it all together, right? Really capable at work, seems totally fine, kind of on the surface. And really that's all you're ever going to get. It's on the surface. Everything else is locked down and has very little access to intimacy, feeling anything other than kind of hollow and somewhat performative, kind of doing it for him. She feels really like she's the adult in the room all the time. And every time someone has let her down, she's kind of quietly closed this door inside. Has decided, of course, they've let me down. It's not safe to rely on anyone. And interestingly, this is the same developmental route for both of these types of behaviors, but there's just really different coping strategies. And they both show up in the bedroom in really different ways. And neither of them are wrong or bad. They just have different coping mechanisms, and they're kind of driving each other nuts. Now, this is really not uncommon for these two different coping mechanisms for this dependency wound to actually be in relationship together. And I do see that sometimes. And it's really hard for them to understand each other because they have radically different ways of viewing human needs and desires and who should be responsible for those things. And so let's go into what is going on with dependency wounds. And look, you can also actually, even within one person, have both of these as well. It sounds confusing, but I think you'll understand it a little bit as we move forward. But what is this wound? What is this dependency wound? Where does it come from? And we'll come back to this couple and this story and kind of what these people both need. So this is the second major developmental task of humans, is as a social species and as one of the most underdeveloped infants in the animal kingdom. We have this big brain as kind of our major, magic. We don't have giant teeth and claws and stuff, and we don't run super duper fast compared to some animals, but we have a big brain. And it means that we're born pretty early in the scheme of things, and we are really not able to do anything. We are incredibly dependent on others to meet our needs. We are not like a moose that just sort of like, sits there for 5 minutes and then kind of gets to its like spindly little legs and like wanders off. That is pretty amazing. Human babies cannot do that. So we are a very social species, and our second major developmental task after learning safety, that it is actually safe to be in our bodies and be in the world, is learning that we can depend on others to meet those needs. And when your caregiver, your primary caregivers, are intermittently available or inconsistent in some way, so like maybe they were really present with a younger child and they became less responsive to you as you got older. So maybe that intermittence actually comes with age, or maybe it comes based on the person's mood. Maybe they're having, something could be completely outside their control, right? Postpartum depression that led to, with a single mom or something, that led to a lot of intermittent dependencies. Also, there could be distractions. Maybe there's a health issue in the family. Maybe there's economic distractions. Maybe they just weren't taught to really be present with needs. There is an entire generation of people that have a lot of dependency wounds because one of the major parenting pieces of advice in the 70s was just to let babies cry. Just if they need it, if they're crying, just ignore them and they will eventually stop. That is a baby that has given up on having its needs met. And it's actually, we know now not to tell parents to do this, but there was a lot of well-intentioned parents that thought that was the best advice. So there's a lot of us out here with dependency wounds. And there's all kinds of ways that you as a young child, this tends to be fairly young in childhood, but it's not as early as the safety wound. But this is infancy through toddlerhood, essentially. And there's two conclusions that can be made from this experience in the child's mind, typically. These are the most common ones. One conclusion, which tends to happen early, is my needs are at risk of not being met. I need to stay close, keep signaling, and keep the connection active. And I need to pursue connection. And that tends to lead to what we will call the over-dependent side of a dependency wound. The other conclusion that can happen for the child is, and especially if they've tried to stay close and keep signaling and keep the connection active and it didn't work, the other conclusion they can make is it's useless to depend on anyone. Needing is never going to my needs will never be met. And so I have to take care of myself. And both of these are intelligent and protective responses. Neither of them are wrong or pathological or bad, and they're wise responses for a child. Once we get into adulthood, they might not be serving our adult relationships and intimacy particularly well if we have held on to them. And most of us have held on to them unless they have been really explicitly worked on and healed. Most of us have really, and I mean, to the extent that we can heal any of these, right? You will always have some aspect of grief or hurt from early childhood wounds. They kind of persist, but they don't persist at the same level where they are sort of subconsciously running the show. They don't have to persist in terms of running your adult relationships inadvertently. They don't have to persist behaviorally, and you don't have to feel them quite as intensely or have them be triggered so horribly. So a lot of that stuff can be healed, even if you will always, we always carry our scars, right? But in this case, if this kind of situation happened where as a child, you don't get the safety to be dependent on someone consistently, right? Then we have a particular response to that as a child. And depending on which sort of fork in the road your child self took, we tend to develop one of these types of coping mechanisms. And they're recognized across all kinds of psychological frameworks. So the Somatica Institute, where I trained, calls them overdependent and underdependent character types. Those are based on the wound being the dependency wound, right? Hakomi calls them dependent, endearing, and self-reliant. And they both also fall in Freudian, which I don't subscribe to, so I'll mention it and then move on. They fall under the oral label, which, of course, I find pretty reductive and pathologizing. But the neuroaffective model also maps them. Both are under the attunement survival style. And one of them is pride-based. So this I will take care of myself, right? And one of them is more insecurity-based. And so they're the same wound with multiple faces observed across all these different lineages of psychological study. So this is all well-founded. And what it is important to us, though, is what does it feel like from the inside? How do I recognize this? How do I understand how it shapes who I am in my eroticism? And how can I use that to de-shame myself around my own desires? And then what are the sort of tendencies in relationship that I might want to watch out for? And think about how I could compensate or overcome, or what kinds of skills I might want to work on building to overcome some of these tendencies in relationship that might be kind of shooting me in the foot and not giving me the type of connection that I want, right? So those are the important questions for us as adults dealing with if we recognize ourselves in this type of dependency wound. So none of it is bad. None of it is better or worse than the other. There's a bit of a cultural pitfall here that hyper-independence, at least in American culture, is very, very, shall we say, idolized. And it's idolized to the point of being kind of absurd because no one is actually completely independent. We are all interdependent. And what we're going for is a healthy interdependence where we can depend on people and we feel like we can depend and trust on people to help us when we need to or to connect with us when we want to, but that we don't have to completely depend on everybody. We don't have to sort of throw our inner child at people and say, you take this, right? But we have a healthy interdependence where we're independent enough to sort of function in our adult relationships and our society without feeling horrible all the time, like people are supposed to be caretaking us and they're somehow failing. But we're also not isolating ourselves. And so there's a happy middle ground that is kind of missing from the default settings when you have a dependency wound. And so here's what it feels like from the inside for both of these. And they're very different in a lot of ways, but they're also really similar in a lot of ways. So for the over-dependent tendency, tends to feel like your needs are just never being met and you desperately want them to be met and you want them to be intuited by the people closest to you. You want them to just know and just take care of it and just do it. And it's almost impossible to imagine why do they not want to do this? Of course they should want to meet my needs. And it's kind of this sense of never quite being taken care of enough, really wanting to feel taken care of. Even when you are receiving some care, it feels like it's insufficient, like it's never enough. And when your needs are not met, you can get really confused, tendency to be kind of inarticulate, like you just can't get the words out. And also a lot of times enraged, there will be an inner just furious. You might experience it as frustration, but it also can feel like you're kind of almost pushing away a real deep rage. And it can be the confusion, the inability to articulate how it feels, and the rage can feel disproportionate to what's actually going on, especially to people on the receiving end. But it makes sense. It makes sense to you emotionally. And overdependent folks are also often genuinely skilled at things like self-care, especially rest, protecting your kind of limited resources. but often are not showing high levels of independence. So they may take like a receiver role in the home such that a partner is doing a lot of the chores or caretaking, and they're not noticing or being kind of responsible for looking around and seeing what needs to be done. They're just sort of like receiving it and maybe not even noticing it, that it's happening, or that they could do a share of that. In contrast, the underdependent tends to have kind of a sense of pride in not needing anything and being hyper independent. And that is often reinforced by culture, especially for people who are socialized as men, but really for anybody especially in American culture. Not asking for what you need, and often not even knowing that you have needs, like not even really identifying as a person who has needs or knowing what they might be. And things like needing reassurance is like, the idea is like, what are you talking about? I don't need reassurance. Who would reassure me anyway? A really classic example of this, of being underdependent, is me driving myself to the hospital when I sprained my ankle. When people were literally offering to drive me to the hospital, I could not even conceive of taking them up on that. Like, it was so far out of my like realm of possibility. And this is one of the things that if you are underdependent, you will, one of the ways to recognize is that other people look at you kind of crazy because you will not accept help. And you do not know how to accept help very graciously. You feel incredibly guilty and weird if somebody wants to help you. You're just like, why? What is this about? And communicating needs feels pointless or just too foreign to think anybody would actually want to help, or that you might actually need help, right? Unless you are literally like, both your legs are cut off, you're going to try to drive yourself to the hospital. Underdependence when you are hurt or let down, because we can still be hurt and let down by people even when we don't recognize that we have needs. That doesn't mean we don't have them. We just don't recognize that we have them. When you are hurt or let down, you can tend to go quiet and shut down or just leave, and often not tell anyone. Like, this doesn't feel good. I'm just out of here. I'm not going to ask for any accommodations. I'm not going to ask for any changes to anything. I'm not going to offer feedback that hurt or let me down. I'm just going to bail or shut down. And we tend to interpret any letdown as confirmation of what is already known. Like, depending on other people is foolish. And that tends to be the interpretation. So it's a hyper independence that doesn't really allow for needs. And in fact, tends to be, if you meet an overdependent person, what's called overdependent in somatica, those people tend to kind of rub an underdependent person the wrong way, because they are so good at actually being like asking for help or receiving care. They'll just take in all the care. They'll take all the care. And we're just like, wait, this feels like it feels never ending. And it kind of is. The overdependents are a little bit, it tends to feel never ending needs to them too. But for an underdependent, it can be like, ugh, like, I don't like that. I don't feel comfortable around that person, right? They have needs. And that tells us that we are not allowing ourselves to have needs. It tells you more about the person who's feeling the ick than it does about anybody. But it's interesting in relationship when that happens, because it's very hard for these people to understand each other. So how does this shape erotic emotions? So for the overdependent, the resolution pathway to this, the erotic space is a place to finally receive full, attentive, unconditional care that was missed. And sometimes people get really hyperfixated on sex when they're underdependent, because it actually feels like a time when you are like, your entire body is being taken care of. And it can feel, you can get really desperate to have more sex because of that. But on the positive side of things, it can be really lovely, like a really deep, beautiful openness to sexuality, a real interest in this kind of like cared for, pampered, loved, attuned to those types of erotic emotions. Like we just want to like a lot of like romantic interest can be present with these people, not always. But having this idea of like someone is tracking me completely and I am safe to just like need them. And that act of sexual desire can feel like, and having that desire be met can feel really good. And if someone says no, though, even if, it's just like in the moment, they're just not, their body's not up for it for whatever reason, it can feel like a massive problem because this underlying wound is triggered and rejected. You can feel like so rejected, even when you're not being rejected, right? As a person, they're just saying, hey, not right now. It can feel really dramatic and really problematic. So that is one clue that you might, and I'm not trying to diagnose anybody here with anything in particular. This is all information for you to be like, oh gosh, I think I recognize that. And based on my life history and my experiences, maybe I have a little bit of that. And maybe I might want to think about how I want to play with it and how I might want to learn some new skills, right? For all of these wounds, every single one of them. Another thing that's interesting about the overdependent is in the erotic space, they can be really into age play. That's not to say they're the only people into age play, but this is particularly resonant for people in the overdependent dependency wound side. Something like mommy dom, daddy dom, or any dynamic where like a nurturing parental energy is present explicitly. And it's because it allows this like deep unmet need of being a vulnerable child who is completely taken care of to be met with full safety and agency on purpose. And that is really understandable and makes a lot of sense. And is one of the reasons why it's even baked into our eroticism in the first place to play with unmet needs. So, and then, importantly, not everyone with this wound will want the age play dimension, right? The specific erotic emotions can be sought out in many forms. You might just want to be cared for or adored or like love, like babied, right? You want to feel held. You might just want to feel like somebody just really, really wants to be there with you. The underdependent, their resolution pathway is more for like mutuality, this like connection with someone that they can really trust not to let them down, and genuine equality. They tend to desire lovers that feel very grounded and adult and capable. And the specific erotic emotions might be equal, collaborative, mutual, respected, passionate, independence, and also not responsible. The sense of that emotion of like, I don't have to carry this. It's like we are genuinely equal and I don't have to perform. But interestingly, I actually see in a lot of underdependence, they have the same desires as the overdependence to be deeply cared for and attuned to, and to receive a lot of care. And that's because that's the exiled need, right? The exiled desire is to even have needs. So the erotic desire is actually to have needs be like celebrated and cared for by somebody. And so that's actually really common for the underdependent as well. And the ways that this shows up, okay, in relationship dynamics, the dependency wound shows up really differently for the overdependence and the underdependence side of this wound. These different coping mechanisms, it just really shows up dramatically differently. So kind of back to our original story, right, of this couple, the overdependent person tends to often feel like they just are never quite getting as much as they need. They always want more. And their partner may initially feel drawn in by warmth and the sort of sweetness and endearingness of this person, but then gradually starts feeling worn out, like they can never give enough and they can't ever get it right. The person can be good at asking for help, but with intimacy tends to want a partner to just intuit their needs and maybe really mad when the partner doesn't, or when the partner's just not available for taking care of those needs in that moment. So the response for the overdependent can be confusion, the rage, and withdrawal, which can feel really unfair to a partner who didn't understand what was needed in the first place, or who doesn't understand why them just like not being available for this particular thing is actually not okay, right? And there can be a lot of kind of emotional manipulation then from that place. And in bed, they may want constant reassurance. They may struggle to be present without a lot of verbal or physical confirmation that the other person is having fun and that they're wanted. Like a moment of inattention or like needing something different can land as rejection. It's this inner child's desire for a parent to be like at an infancy level where you didn't have words for things that you needed, but it's like this urge, this real deep desire to be completely cared for in a way that you don't ever have to articulate anything and have someone just be completely focused on you and attuned to you. And then an infant's response to not getting that met is actual rage, right? You've seen it, you've heard it. And so the inner child is doing that in relationship, and oftentimes a lot of times in sex. And so it can feel really hard to describe why it feels so urgent, but that's part of what's happening. With the underdependent, it's really different. So their partner actually might feel helpless or like unnecessary because the underdependent doesn't actually need them for anything. Like, it's like, why do you even want me here? You are doing everything yourself. And if I even like kind of like trying to help, it's like, no, I got it. Right. Do you want me to come with you to your cancer treatment? No, I got it. Right. Even, like I've spilled something out of the fridge and it's everywhere and it's like, nope, I got it. I'm going to clean it all up. Right. And we often feel, if you're in partnership with that person, like there's not really any room for you to help them or like support them. But interestingly, they often inside, they actually want partners to just magically want to do exactly what they want. Because it's just like the overdependent, but in this case, it's because they believe that asking for their needs or asking for help is weak and pointless. And so they actually want someone who just already wants to do all the things that they want. They don't want to have to actually say what they want, right? So it's really convenient if somebody just happens to already want to do all those things. But each time a partner lets them down, even in like a small, normal way, if an underdependent will quietly kind of file it under the like, I knew it category. It'll be like, yep, exactly. Not safe to ask for anything, not safe to have needs, totally pointless, right? And oftentimes their partner might not know any of that's happening until the underdependent person is like walking out the door, right? A lot has already gone on and they've just kind of dealt with it quietly. And by building up a lot of resentment, right? And in bed, they may be physically present, but always kind of feel like they're holding something back. And from the inside, it can feel like it's just really hard to let go. Like it's really hard to feel like you're getting enough to actually let go. And it can be really hard to ask for what you want. So you can also just tolerate whatever the other person wants and have sex the way somebody else wants, sometimes for years, and not really ever even identify your own needs or desires. So that said, these wounds often co-occur with other ones, right? Especially, we're going to talk about the worth wound. We already talked about the safety wound. So there's a lot of people out there. This is not weird. There are so many of us out there with all of these different wounds. And if you identify any of these things sound familiar, then And I encourage you to do it for yourself, not to try to like pathologize or identify your partner necessarily. You can share this with your partner so that they can see how it feels like for them from the inside. They're going to know more about that. But none of this is bad or wrong or means somebody is broken, right? So what does it look like when we start to notice, adapt, start to figure out how to help ourselves out of these sort of patterns of behavior that aren't helping us, right? For the erotic desires, you don't need to do that. You can just play with them and you can like learn to embrace them and learn to get them met on purpose. And that's really great and fun and hot. Yay. But for the ways that we kind of show up in relationship in ways that may not be that useful or functional in relationship, we can change that. And so we might want to start thinking about, okay, for an overdependent, it's really about learning to name specific needs rather than staying in this general territory of like, I just need more. I need more, right? We want to identify specific things and also start learning to see what you can give yourself first. Because we have to start, if you're an overdependent, we have to start cultivating the space in you where you fill up with your own inner child has needs. You identify them and you start parenting them first. And that doesn't mean you can't rely on other people or ask other people for help or support with that. But the only person who can truly parent it in a way where it's not going to feel just this like gaping black hole that just sucks all the stuff, all the energy out, is if you parent it yourself, because you got to parent it first. So we want to help you identify your inner child, know how it feels, start parenting that inner child yourself, and identifying the specific needs that you have so that you can actually ask for them in clear ways and you don't have to expect people to be mind readers. And then building some tolerance for the gap between what a partner can actually give and what the inner child wound is asking for. And that gap is actually really large because you'll never have a partner who actually wants to be your parent and who has capacity to be your parent. And that's okay. And that's not a character failure on either side. But a big part of building a tolerance for that gap between what an adult partner can give and what the inner child wants is learning how to actually parent yourself through those moments. And then finding your erotic emotions that feel really alive for you and actually asking for them explicitly and figuring out how to play with them explicitly. And that can be really fun. For the underdependent folks out there, practicing the very uncomfortable act of asking for something. Start small. Ask for something little, like just asking for some help and actually allowing yourself to receive it, tolerating whatever the response is, and updating the conclusion that depending on someone always ends in letdown. It doesn't actually. And there's a lot of ways that people already have helped you, even when you haven't asked. But starting to identify your own needs and allowing yourself to have them. So the beginnings, one, asking for little things that help, but also starting to identify what are your needs as a human being who is a social animal and interdependent on other humans. You do have needs for love, for approval, for support, for reassurance, for assistance, right? What does that look like in your life? Can you acknowledge that you have those? And can you let yourself show up for them sometimes? And it's like building the muscle and building the evidence that someone is actually interested and wanting to do that. And that may mean sometimes even asking, hey, I'm working on asking for help. If I ask, can you tell me honestly whether you really want to do it or not? You can start learning how to do that. And then the more you receive the help or you receive care for your needs, the more you can start believing that it's possible to actually trust people to do that. And also, I would say one thing that's really helpful for underdependence is letting a partner know when they've actually hurt you. Instead of just closing the door quietly and like walking out, instead of just filing it in the like, I'll never get what I want, it's pointless to ask. actually letting someone know when they've let you down and telling them how to love you and what you actually need. Now, look, they may not always be able to do it, and that's okay. Other adults are not on the hook for taking care of our every whim, but they probably can do a lot more than you might be giving them credit for. So being willing to tell someone when they've hurt you is a really big step towards starting to be able to depend on people emotionally. And for both, just getting support. Now, look, it doesn't have to be a sex coach. You could go to a very good attachment-focused therapist. I really recommend Hakomi therapists for this kind of stuff. The patterns often benefit from a practitioner who can provide a lot of attunement in session that models what's possible in relationship. And so what I would avoid is like a psychoanalytical type of therapist who's not going to actually provide that attunement and is not a relational therapist. So you're going to want, if you are working with a therapist, working with a relational therapist in some sort of relational modality is much more effective for this, because especially for these dependency wounds, if you have someone who like will not engage with you, it's really rewounding. And I highly recommend against that. I have definitely seen that be not helpful. So I hope this is interesting and illuminating for you. Thank you for geeking out on all this stuff with me. I am glad you're here. If you want to know more about erotic emotions in particular and psychological arousal, please go to episode 5. That is kind of the baseline episode on that topic. We'll explain a lot about it. You can also go to my Wheel of Erotic Emotions, which is linked in my show notes. You can get that. And we'll be back in the future on trust wounds, autonomy wounds, and worth wounds still to come. So see you here next time. Hey, before you go, if you enjoyed this show, I want to invite you to check out one of my favorite things that I've ever created. It's a free guide called Get Out of Your Head, a starter guide to releasing the pressure, shame, and shoulds around intimacy. It has 4 reflection exercises that go deeper than anything you'll find in a typical freebie, and most people feel a shift just after part 1. So go grab it at laurajurgens.com/guide. The link is in the show notes. And if you're ready to find out what your specific path looks like, I'd love to talk to you. Booking info is also in the show notes, and I will see you here next week.